He raised his glass and said, into the microphone, in front of everyone, "To our son, the one who actually made something of himself." He paused for effect. The room laughed. My aunt laughed. My uncle laughed. My uncle laughed. The neighbours who'd known me since I was 7 years old, they laughed too. I was sitting 2 tables back, not at the family table, not near the front. I was seated beside a co-worker of my brother's whom I had never met, next to someone's date, next to a woman who kept checking her phone. My father had said it was a seating issue. He said they ran out of space at the head table. He said I'd understand. I sat there with a fork in my hand and a piece of salmon going cold on my plate. And I smiled. I smiled because what else do you do when a room full of people is laughing at something your father just said about you, and they don't even realize they're laughing at you, and you're not sure if that makes it better or worse? My brother, Nathan, had just passed the bar. He was 27 and he was glowing. He deserved to glow. I want to be clear about that. What happened that night was not Nathan's fault. Nathan had always been kind to me, quietly, in the way younger siblings sometimes are when they understand something about the family they grew up in that nobody talks about out loud. But my father stood at that microphone and he said what he said, and he meant it, and he thought it was funny, and maybe it was to him. To everyone who didn't know what those words sounded like from my side of the room. To Nathan, he said, who proves that at least one of our kids pays attention. More laughter. I set down my fork. I folded my napkin. I picked up my purse and I walked out of the banquet hall, and I did not say goodbye to anyone, and no one came after me. I drove back to my apartment in Mississauga. I sat in the parking garage for about 20 minutes with the engine off. Then I went upstairs and I made tea, and I did not cry, which surprised me because I thought I would. I did not hear from my parents that night. I did not hear from them the next day. My mother texted me 4 days later to ask if I'd remembered to take the centerpiece I'd been promised. I had not taken the centerpiece. I told her that. She said that was too bad, that someone else had taken it home. That was the last conversation we had for 8 years. I should explain what it was like before that night, because that night didn't come from nowhere. Nothing like that ever does. My parents came to Canada in the early 90s from the Philippines, and they worked in the way that immigrants work when they arrive with nothing and are determined to leave their children with something. My father drove a taxi for 6 years before he got his electrician's license. My mother cleaned offices at night and took English courses in the morning, and eventually became an office administrator at a dental clinic in Brampton. They were not bad people. I want to say that clearly, because sometimes when I tell this story, people assume I'm saying they were monsters, and they weren't. They were people who had come from a place where survival was the goal and they had survived, and now they wanted proof. Nathan was their proof. I think, the question they hadn't expected to have to answer. I was the older one. I should have been the example. Instead, I was the one who dropped out of the business program at Ryerson after 1 year because I could not make myself care about it, not even a little. I was the one who spent 3 years working at a bookstore and genuinely loving it, which my father could not understand. I was the one who eventually went back to school, not for business, but for early childhood education, and who became an ECE at a centre in Oakville, working with toddlers and preschoolers, earning $32,000 a year to start, which my father referred to as the hobby job. I love that job. I want to say that too. I was good at it. The kids were good at being kids. It was quiet and it was hard, and it was exactly where I wanted to be. But at every family dinner, at every holiday, at every phone call that my mother made on Sunday evenings, there was always a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes not, where the conversation turned to Nathan and what Nathan was doing. Nathan's articling position. Nathan's apartment in Yorkville. Nathan's girlfriend, who's also a lawyer. And then there was a moment where someone would look at me and ask how the kids were, meaning my students, not my children, in the tone you use when you're asking about someone's very minor hobby. My father never said the quiet part out loud, not until the night of Nathan's call to the bar celebration. But I had been hearing the quiet part my whole life. I just hadn't known how loud it would sound when he finally said it into a microphone. The first year of no contact was the strangest. I kept reaching for my phone to call my mother on Sundays and then putting it back down. I kept cooking her recipes and feeling her in the kitchen with me. I kept driving past the exit on the 401 that would take me to my parents' house in Brampton, and sometimes I would slow down slightly before I passed it. And then I wouldn't take it. My friends didn't fully understand. My friend Lily, who was also an ECE and who was from a large Jamaican Canadian family and who called her mother every single day, used to look at me with this careful expression when I mentioned my parents, like she was trying to figure out how concerned to be. They didn't mean it that way, she said once. He did though, I said. She didn't say anything after that, which was the right call. I found a therapist named Dr. Osei who worked out of a clinic near Square One. She specialized in family estrangement and immigrant family dynamics, and she did not once suggest that I should forgive my father because he came from a different generation or a different culture. She said that harm doesn't need to be intentional to be real. She said I was allowed to decide what I could and couldn't carry. I carried a lot in those years. I moved to a better apartment. I got promoted to lead educator, then program supervisor. I enrolled in the undergraduate education program at York, part-time, and I went slowly, but I went. I made friends through a hiking group I found on Meetup. I started running, badly, and then less badly. I got a cat named Fig who bit everyone except me. Nathan reached out a few times, not on behalf of our parents, just as himself. We had coffee twice. I told him I wasn't ready to see them, and he said he understood and he meant it. He didn't push. He sent me a card when I finished my degree. It said, "You always knew what you were doing. I think you knew before any of us." I put it on my refrigerator. It's still there. 8 years after the night of the banquet hall, my phone rang on a Thursday evening in February. I was on the couch with Fig, eating leftover butter chicken and watching something I can't remember. I looked at the screen. It was a number I didn't recognize. An Ontario number, a 905 area code. I answered. "It's your brother." He'd gotten a new number. He apologized for not warning me. His voice had that specific quality, careful, slightly too even, that I recognized from our childhood, from the times he used to come into my room after a bad dinner to see if I was okay. "What happened?" I said. He told me. My mother had had a stroke. It was a small one, a TIA, the doctors were calling it, a transient ischemic attack. She was stable. She was at Brampton Civic. She was asking for me. I said, "Is she okay?" He said, "She's scared. And she's asking for you." I said, "Does she know why I'm not there?" He said, "I think she does." I sat with that for a moment. Fig walked across my lap and settled. The butter chicken was getting cold. "Nathan," I said, "what does she say when she talks about me, when I'm not around?" There was a long pause. "She says she misses you," he said. "And Dad," another pause. "He doesn't say much," Nathan said. "He just looks at your old school pictures sometimes, the ones on the wall in the hallway." I didn't say anything. "I'm not asking you to fix it," Nathan said. "I just thought you should know. I didn't go that night. I need to be honest about that." I went home and I stared at the ceiling and I thought about every version of how this could go, and I decided I wasn't ready, and I went to sleep. But I called Dr. Osei the next morning and we talked for an hour, and by the end of that hour I had a different idea of what I was actually afraid of. I wasn't afraid of being hurt again. I was afraid that if I went, it would mean that the 8 years hadn't mattered. The tide just fold, the way they'd always expected me to fold. Dr. U said going back doesn't undo what you built. You built it. It goes with you. I thought about that for 2 more days, and then I drove to Brampton. My mother was in a room with a window that overlooked a parking structure. She looked smaller than I remembered, which happens, I think, when you haven't seen someone in a long time. Your memory holds them at a size that reality doesn't always keep. She saw me come through the door and her face did something complicated. She didn't cry. She reached out her hand. I sat down beside the bed. Neither of us said anything for a minute. "I didn't think you'd come," she said finally. Her speech was slightly slow but clear. They told Nathan she would recover fully. I wasn't sure I would, I said. She looked at me for a long moment. I've thought about what your father said at Nathan's party. I didn't respond. I should have said something, she said. That night, I should have said something to him. Or to you. I didn't. No, I said. You didn't. She looked at her hands. I don't know how to explain it in a way that makes it better. You don't have to explain it in a way that makes it better, I said. I don't need it to be better. I just needed you to know that it happened. She nodded slowly. We stayed like that for a while. A nurse came in and checked something and left. The parking structure outside the window was filling up with the morning rush. Your father wants to see you, she said. He won't say it like that, but he does. I know, I said. I'll think about it. And I meant it, not as a dismissal. I meant it. I was actually genuinely going to think about it. That was more than I'd been able to say in 8 years. My father was in the waiting room at the end of the hall. I almost didn't see him at first. He'd gotten older in the way men his age do. His hair fully grey, his posture slightly rounded. He was sitting with his hands on his knees and a paper cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He looked up when I walked over. I sat down across from him, and I didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything, and we just sat like that. Your mother says you came, he said finally. I came, I said. He looked at the coffee cup. He turned it in his hands. I don't know how to talk to you, he said. I never knew how. You managed to talk at Nathan's party, I said. I hadn't planned to say it. It came out flat and quiet and true. He flinched. And then he didn't make an excuse, which I hadn't expected. He just sat with it. That was wrong, he said. What I said it because I was proud of Nathan, and I didn't think. He stopped. That is not a good reason. No, I said. It's not. I've thought about it, he said. More than you probably think. I looked at him. He had my grandmother's eyes, which I had always known and sometimes forgot. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hospital. I work with children, I said. 4- and 5-year-olds. Do you know what the research says about the things parents tell their kids about who they are? He shook his head. It becomes their voice, I said. The voice inside. The one they hear when things get hard. That's what you gave me. That's what I've been working to replace for 8 years. He didn't look away. I'm not asking you to be someone different, I said. I'm too old for that, and so are you. But I needed to say that to your face. And I needed you to hear it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I hear it. He didn't apologize, not in so many words. Maybe he didn't have the language for it. Maybe he'd need more time. I don't know. But he said he heard it, and he looked like he meant it, and that was something I had not expected to get. I drove back to Mississauga that afternoon. Fig was waiting on the other side of the door, indifferent and hungry. I fed him, and I sat on the kitchen floor for a while, which is something I do sometimes when I need to feel the ground. Nathan texted, How did it go? I texted back, I think okay. I don't know yet. He sent back a single thumbs up, which was very Nathan. I didn't suddenly have a family again. That's not what happened. What happened was smaller and more real than that. I had said the thing I'd needed to say for 8 years, out loud, to the person who needed to hear it, and he had not argued with me or minimized it or turned it into something about himself, and my mother had told me she should have spoken up. Neither of those things erased anything, but they were real, and they were mine, and I hadn't expected to leave that hospital with anything at all. The voice my father gave me, I'd been working to replace it for a long time. I'd replaced most of it with something better, something quieter and steadier and actually mine. I wasn't useless. I had never been useless. I just hadn't known for a long time that I was allowed to say that. I used to think the hardest part was the night it happened, my father at that microphone, the room laughing, me sitting 2 tables back with a fork in my hand and nowhere to put what I was feeling. But the hardest part wasn't that night. The hardest part was the morning after. and the morning after that, and all the mornings I spent deciding, slowly and without any fanfare, who I was going to be anyway. What I've come to understand is that what happens to us is only part of the story. The other part, the bigger part, I think, is what we decide to do with the space that opens up after. When I walked out of that banquet hall, I didn't have a plan. I had a parking garage and a cup of tea, and the specific silence of a Sunday night when no one calls. That silence was its own kind of answer. It told me I'd been waiting for someone else to define me, and that I could stop. The 8 years I spent building my own life weren't dramatic. There was no single moment where I woke up transformed. There was therapy. There was a degree I finished slowly, on nights and weekends when I was tired and not sure it mattered. There was a job I loved that most people in my family didn't take seriously, and I kept doing it anyway because I knew what it was worth even when they didn't. That's not a small thing. Knowing the value of what you do, independent of whether the people who raised you can see it, that takes something. It takes honesty with yourself, and a willingness to keep going even when the validation isn't coming. I think about the kids I worked with, 4- and 5-year-olds who were still at the beginning of figuring out who they were. The research is clear. The voices children hear early become the voices they carry. My father gave me a voice that said I wasn't enough. I spent years learning to hear it for what it was, his limitation, not my truth. That work was not passive. It required me to look clearly at what had happened, to understand it without excusing it, and to decide what I was actually made of, rather than what I'd been told. And then there was the hospital. Walking back in, sitting down, saying the thing I needed to say. That was not weakness, and it was not surrender. It was something harder than either of those. It was choosing to stand in front of the person who'd hurt me and speak plainly, without cruelty, without collapsing. My father said he heard me. That was not everything, but it was real, and I earned it, and no version of staying quiet would have gotten me there. I didn't go back to fix my family. I went back to finish something for myself. There's a difference, and it matters. What I know now is this. The life I built in those 8 years, the work, the degree, the friendships, the slow and unglamorous process of learning to trust my own judgment. None of that disappeared when I walked into that hospital. I brought it with me. That's the thing about the person you become when no one's watching. They come with you everywhere. I wasn't useless. I never was. I just had to be willing to know that, even before anyone else was willing to say it.